The topic of the day today is more biases and fallacies that continually try to trip us up and make us make bad decisions against our better intentions. So we have three more today that we're going to talk about. Because if anybody saw the last video, we talked about three. It was a long video. We thought it was great. Your mileage may vary.
This one will also be great. So the first one, we have three we're going to talk about today. And the first one was is it ad hominem?
Ad hominem, yeah.
Yeah, which is Latin for to the person.
Yeah. So it basically means that when you hear an idea, you will, and maybe you disagree with it, you will attack the person and not the idea. And so it kind of delegitimizes your argument against something, and sometimes also for, right? So a lot of times when you read about the ad hominem, it's very much like an attack against a person. It sounds very aggressive. We'll talk a little bit about examples, but yes, it is that. But sometimes it can also be that you are biased towards a person, like rather than necessarily their idea. So like you're supporting an idea because of the person and not because of the legitimacy of the idea itself.
Yeah.
So you can kind of see both things at play. So that's what the ad hominem fallacy is. So sometimes you hear like it thrown around on the internet a lot. So if you spend any time, kind of in any kind of forum or Reddit, etc., and you observe a lot of the discussions, you'll see a lot of people throwing around, oh, well, that's an ad hominem attack. And you're like, yes, correct. So that's if you spent much time on the internet, you probably have heard of this one.
Yeah. It's funny that like it goes both ways. That if someone say your boss really likes you, they're more likely to give your ideas thought and consideration, and then if they don't like somebody, they're not going to even consider them because they just don't like that person, and they associate them with negative aspects rather than, even if their idea is positive and like has potential, they're just gonna just have a mental block when kind of trying to absorb that idea.
Yeah. And so where it shows up in the workplace, because when you hear the description of it, you automatically assume, because it's described like as an attack, you automatically assume that it's very obvious, So if, Leslie's like, hey, I think we should go for coffee. And I'm like, Leslie, you're a terrible person. And that's a terrible idea, right? And it's just not. It's just not, it doesn't really show up like that in work, right? It really doesn't show up like that in the workplace. It shows up a little bit more subtly where it can almost seem legitimate, where, someone might say, oh, I think this is a great idea for the company. And someone will say, well, you've only been here a few weeks, so we're not really going to consider that idea. And that's really about the person. I know it's about the circumstance, but it's about the person. So you're basically saying we're not going to give that idea any credence because you haven't been in this workplace for as long as I have. There's no mention of the idea there, right? And so it shows up, I think, more mildly. Still is destructive, right? But mildly. So it's not, when you're watching out for work, it's not necessarily you're watching out for someone being like, well, I hate you and your ideas suck. Right? You're actually.
But also look out for that too, just in case.
Sure, but you won't miss that. You're not going to miss that one. Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. It's all back to like the mental shortcuts, cognitive biases, as we're talking about. Like you just kind of associate things with things that you're used to, or that stand out to you that they're not there that long, so that is at the top of your mind. And it's just all the mental shortcuts we make to make decisions based on like experiences or things we've seen, or people we know, all that type of stuff. And you don't even notice you're doing it. They're so minor, but there's so many influences that are that influence your decision around things like that.
Yeah, so like, I mean, I kind of ran into this problem sometimes. There was somebody that worked for me who was they didn't really have the sunniest of dispositions, right? Which is fine, right? Like, but unfortunately we kind of worked in that like environment where it's like everybody needs to be like so positive all the time about everything and like really energetic, and it was just like, oh, okay, but like, could we just not? And so this person did not have the sunniest of disposition in an environment where people like really pushed you having that. And they had a lot of really valid points about, things that were not going well. They weren't really experienced necessarily enough to come up with fully formed solutions, right? Which was just their experience level, not really to do with like a will. It was skill, not will. But they had like the semblance of it, right? So they would say, these things are bad and we should think about doing these things instead. and I would get a lot of pushback when I was pushing these ideas forward, or they'd say them in different things. I would hear back in a roundabout ways like, oh, they're always so negative, like, and you know, it was very much the like, well, you know, we're not really going to consider that because that person's always like really negative about everything. And it was just like, but they're right though.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter if
they're correct. It doesn't matter if they're negative about it. Like it's a correct assessment of the situation and a potential solution that we should at least explore. Right? You can't just discount it just because you perceive them to be a negative kind of, you know, more critical person. So that's like a great example of how I've seen it show up.
Yeah. Just an automatic reaction sometimes to just your personal feelings about people, and and again, people might not even notice they're doing it.
No,
and it's hard to point out to somebody to say, hey, I think you're saying that because you don't like them or because you have some kind of personal bias against them, but it shows up a lot. So that was that one. What was the next one?
Well, just the way to deal with it.
Sorry, I just want to get this over.
You're just like, no, I just want to complain about it.
No solutions, only complaints.
Everyone. So I mean, most of it again, it's back to like knowledge is power, right? You do kind of have to call it out. It could be politely. It could be like, okay, well, if we remove where the idea is coming from, can we like examine the idea on its own merit? Right? Is a way, like corporate speak way of talking about it. But really just kind of presenting objective facts. So, you know, someone's like, well, I don't like this idea because this person is saying it. You know, that's essentially what they're saying. You're like, okay, well, let's look at all of the ideas on the table and look at the data and weigh up like the pros and cons and make a decision that way. So it's really just about steering it back to like the idea itself, rather than anything else. So again, this isn't necessarily as, I would say, bad. Like now we could rank them as some of the other ones, or well, harder to deal with as some of the other ones. Mainly because if you call it out, it can be easier to deal with, and it's actually much easier to deal with in a group setting as well. Where it becomes difficult to do is like if you're in a one-on-one, right, and that one person is just like very insistent, or if there just really isn't an avenue to call somebody out, right, on it without, you know, risking something yourself. But
because other group members might agree with that person and they might not have the same experiences, or even if they do find that person negative, they can see that it's a good idea regardless of the personal aspect of the idea.
Yeah, I mean, I find that even if they might agree with maybe an opinion of a person, in a group setting, it's easier to deal with because, you know, it's more obvious in a group when you say, okay, great, well, how about we just like look at this idea? You, in a group setting, it's you kind of realize very quickly that like, oh, if I was to say, no, I actually also don't like that person, you realize how stupid that looks. And so people are less likely to do it because it kind of makes people aware that like, oh yeah, actually maybe we should just look at the idea.
They're more conscious of having more people there, like, you know, in the room, so they're less likely to be harsher with the feedback. Or maybe they would be, but you would like to think.
I find that people are more rigorous about being able to justify their opinion with more people. So like in public, I guess, for want of a better word, because even a small group is kind of public. I think people are more rigorous about having to justify their opinion in the workplace, right? And so a lot worse things are said, you know, behind closed doors. And in a group setting, people kind of have to be able to defend their position in a way that's a lot more factual. And I think that's why it's easier to deal with in a group setting. Yeah, that's the ad hominem attack.
Cool name.
Internet people will have been familiar with that one quite a lot.
I never knew the name for it until we started doing this, which is cool. Again, learning so much. The next one we were going to discuss was anchoring bias, I think.
Anchoring bias, yes.
Yeah. Take a breath before you
take a deep breath. So the anchoring bias is when your brain locks in on the first piece of information that you receive, and it hones in on that as something that's hard, you know, to forget. It's basically why first impressions count is such a thing, because it really does. Like you're for whatever reason, and there are people out there much better at knowing why than me, and I've actually studied why. Your brain really just kind of does lock into the first piece of information that you come across. And so this can be difficult, especially it's why there's such a standoff in salary negotiations. So, you know, as an employee or potential employee, you are interviewing for a job, every single recruiter, every single person ever will always tell you, do not tell them your salary expectations. And every employer everywhere has said, try to get their salary expectations from them.
Yeah.
Because both of them are playing against the same, you know, bias, which is the first number that's put out there is the one that people will negotiate around. So if you went in and, you know, they were thinking in their heads, maybe this will be, you know, $75,000 a year, and they ask you your salary expectations and you say 60, they're going to negotiate around that, and you'll never get back up to 75, which is why, as a potential employee, you should never be the first to get the number, but you end up in this really awkward stalemate. And so that's, I agreed on kind of that first piece of information is really, really kind of tricky to deal with. This is actually, I think, one of the hardest ones to deal with, because we're not necessarily good at weighing up what things should have most weight. This is, you know, we talked about this in one of the other ones as well, like confirmation bias, like weighing up what piece of information should actually, you know, hold more weight with somebody. Yeah, and then it's like, and again, it is just first impressions. Like, you go in somewhere and you make a bad first impression, that's kind of the first thing that people think of you. So the reason first impressions count is because of anchoring bias, right? And I assume it's named because it's like an anchoring piece of information that like your brain just like really holds on to.
That is the first thing you think of when you think of that person, or it's just your opinion of them is kind of anchored on that first impression.
And it becomes tricky when you're like things like estimating like project deadlines and stuff. So if you're initially saying, okay, we don't really have much information, we think it might take 3 months, but we really don't know until we get into it. And then you get into it and you're like, oh no, actually there's so much more going on. And you go back and say, okay, we said we weren't sure, we thought it might be 3, but actually as it turns out we have more information now and it's going to take 6 months. Then people are going to be disappointed. Like it's almost impossible to avoid the disappointment that you've created because they've really anchored on the 3 month. Even if you put qualifiers around it, even if you said, look, we have no idea, we're kind of hoping 3 months, but until we get into it, it really doesn't matter. You've created a sense that you've somehow underachieved. And so this is also why when people say overpromise, or sorry, under promise and overachieve. Wow, we're really going the other way. When people say under promise and over deliver, this is also because of anchoring. Because what you tell them will be the first impression of you, and how you then perform related to that, or how you advance related to that, sets up disappointment or, you know, happiness. And so, you know, you go into someone and you say, hey, we think it might take 6 months. And then it takes 3. They're like, wow, this is amazing, right? Or actually, let's actually use the same example. You say you think it's going to be 3, it's going to be 6. They're disappointed in you. Doesn't matter how many qualifiers. You say you think it might be 9 months. It ends up being 6. It's the best thing you've ever done. Even though it's still taken 6 months every time.
It's just the perception
of it.
The perception of early delivery versus it's not nonsense, but it's
absolute nonsense. And here's the thing, like it's nonsense, but it's also something to be super conscious of. It's also in play when you budget stuff, like especially as like a contractor. So when people talk about, oh, we need to like put in a tolerance, right? The reason that people will go in and say, okay, we think it's going to cost $1,000, and people say, okay, great, add 20% to it and then give the quote to the client, is because they're saying we're not sure, and if we went back to the client and said, hey, it's actually going to cost us now an extra, you know, $10, they're going to be a lot more upset than if you charge them, you know, $1,011 and it actually costs, you know, $1,010, right? Like, so
that's
so
definitely happened on a project I worked on before for a website, and we wanted our website upgraded, and so we gave them access to the website, told them what we wanted to do, blah 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 blah. All the information was there. They gave us a quote and they started working on the website, but when they got into the nitty-gritty of it, like the back end, things like that, they were like, oh, we're not actually going to be able to do that for the amount we told you. And my CEO was obviously not happy with that. And from my perspective, you know, they gave me, it was hugely different, right? It wasn't even just like a couple of thousand, it was like in the tens of thousands. So from my perspective, you know, we didn't trick them into giving us that quote. We gave them the access, we told them what we wanted, it was very, very clear, and they undersold sold the price for so much, but then made it out to be as if we were the ones that were like wanting, you know, more for less. And we're like, well, you told us this, you're the experts, you went in, we gave you all the tools, blah blah blah, blah, but the onus was on us to be sorry for not giving them enough money. You know, it was, and I could see it from both sides as well. They just kind of really didn't sell themselves well enough, and we ended up paying like maybe half of it, I think, but it kind of left a really bad taste in everybody's mouth, and the CEO was just not happy at all, even though it was still a good price overall. But as you say, that anchored cost and the timeline and everything like that, and then again that looked bad on me because I was going back to her saying, well, they've come back to me and they said it's not going to be this and it's not going to be that. So yeah, I can see it from both sides, you know, having been on both sides of it. So
yeah, it's a tricky one. This one I think is a lot. This is one that I think is actually almost impossible to deal with, right?
Yeah.
So
like chance.
you know, yeah, it's you really do have, like, countering it is actually really just planning for the fact that it exists.
Yeah.
You know, you can't really remove an anchoring bias. It's something our brains kind of do automatically. So really, if you think you're going to encounter it, right, as it relates to setting project deadlines, creating budgets, et cetera, doing performance reviews and so on, then it's really just about trying to get as much data as possible, and so that you give an accurate kind of estimation of whatever estimate that you're doing, if that's kind of what you're doing, so that you're removing the possibility for there to be a discrepancy, and therefore for anchoring bias to create like a sense of disappointment. Obviously, when it comes to things like being the first to crack in a, you know, salary negotiation, I mean, there's no good advice for that. The good advice is don't give your number first.
No.
But like how long you could hold out on that, and if that risks you getting the job in the first place, that's really on a very like case by case basis, right? And that's a real tricky one to do. It's also when you might go in and say, okay, well, I'm going to give a high number because they'll negotiate me down. Sometimes that has lost people jobs because they're like, oh, they're too expensive for me, and they can't remove themselves from that. So even if you, so say you went in to that same $75,000 job and you went in, oh, I want 100,000, and they're like, well, we can only do 75,000. You're like, you know what? Given everything else, I can do it for 75. I've experienced this myself. I've seen this in companies where they'll be like, oh, but you know, they agreed to it, but I just really think they're a flight risk because they wanted more. And so they're completely anchored on that first number that you've given them. So that's just really tricky. Data can help solve it, because if both the potential employer and the potential employee had done the research, they should theoretically be coming in around the same number, but we know that's not really how life works. So that's really, that one is really just about planning around the fact that it exists and trying to mitigate it coming into play as much as possible. But
it's hard to avoid for all of those things you mentioned.
Almost impossible.
Almost always it's going to end up, there's going to be some aspect of it. So making your best estimation and planning for the worst nearly, and then trying to work against that. It's just the knowledge and awareness of that potentially likely happening.
And honestly, also, if it's the one where you've made a bad first impression, it's kind of knowing where to cut your losses, right? If you've made a bad first impression with your manager and you feel like it's going to be an uphill battle to like just get back up to neutral again, you know, I think about looking for a new job. Not because they'll necessarily do anything. It's just you're always going to be fighting that first impression, or you'll have to do so much more to surpass that first impression with most people. So it's also about kind of recognizing, if it has come into play, how to cut your losses on that as well.
You ever notice how sometimes you get a first impression of somebody and you're like, I really don't like that person, but then over time you get used to them and then you do like them in the end. So it's crazy how that works. That happens to me. Like, there's so many people that I would like, oh, I they're not my type of person or whatever, and then after spending some time with them, I'm like, you know what, you're not that bad. So maybe it's best to stick it out sometimes and see, maybe they will fall for you after a few months or something.
It's funny because for me it's normally the opposite.
So
for me, it's normally like, oh, everybody's great, and then they start talking, and I'm like,
that happens too. Yeah. I have a very bad radar for people. I'm like, they seem really nice, and then they do something to like screw me over or someone else, and I'm like, that's not nice. So it can happen both ways. Yeah, but I always find it funny when I think back to people that I initially thought negatively of, like in the workplace or something, and then you get to know them and what makes them kind of tick and things like that, and you're like, oh, okay, that's just so and so. They're just a bit grumpy, but like I like them as a person, you know, they're not awful. Giving people some grace again, like we said.
Yes. And to be clear, actually, in this, we haven't really talked about how to cope with it if it's coming at you.
Yeah.
But in terms of yourself, like being, if you think that you're susceptible or have commonly come across, anchoring bias in yourself, then the way to deal with that is self-awareness.
Yeah.
It's having to challenge, like go back to your original assumption and try and look at it like unemotionally and with just the data and just challenge your original perception of something. And try to take the facts on the table at face value without trying to apply anything else to it.
Yeah.
So yeah, to be clear, I think it's very possible to counter in other people, right, or other like situations where it's coming at you. Yeah. But in yourself, there's for sure ways of addressing it if you think it's something, because we are all susceptible to that one. To be clear, that is like pretty well rooted in there.
And you might be right. All have they to might be awful. They might be awful.
They might be.
But
yeah,
you've given it your best shot at letting.
Yeah, and like the facts will out, hopefully, in most cases. It might take longer than normal sometimes, but normally the truth of a situation or a person or something will win out.
Yeah.
It is also kind of why, like in your case, when you get like that really cheap quote, if something's too good to be true, that can kind of play into it a little bit as well. It's if you think something might be too good to be true because it's outside of the normal trend of whatever the situation you're in, it's worth exploring that to see if it is. You get a quote that's so much cheaper than everybody else's, like why, and it's worth kind of exploring that to see if they're not trying to take advantage of the anchoring bias.
Yeah, I've always found it difficult salary negotiations. This is a primarily female thing, I think, is not negotiating for your salary and just kind of accepting whatever they give you. But as I've gotten older and, obviously talk things through with you and stuff like that and other people that are like older, more experienced or something. And like it's expected that you're going to negotiate your salary. Really, it's not going to look bad on you at all, unless like you're, I don't know, rude about how you go about it. You have to be you have to be quite strategic about how you go about it and like polite and a certain level of professionalism, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But it's the most awkward part, and they're
awkward.
So awkward.
That's probably worthy of a whole other video. Because like we could talk about how to go about negotiating salary, but I think that conversation always has to include the fact that it is incredibly awkward.
Yeah.
And you're gonna feel awkward doing it.
There's
and
no
it's gonna be weird.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to go on instinct as to whether you pushed it too far. Like it's but we could do a whole other video on that.
Yes, I'm sure people can.
And I definitely won't tell you about the time when someone approached me about a job and it sounded really great, and then they gave me the number and I actually could not stop the initial laugh.
It was so bad.
That happened because it was so bad. And I was like, wow, I have just absolutely ruined any potential relationship with this recruiter. It was just so unexpected. I was on a video call. It was just so unexpected. Thankfully it was only the recruiter, but it was just so unexpectedly low that it just caught me by surprise, and I just reacted in the moment. I did not. Anyway. Yeah, so don't
go back to your thing where they want to offer, like, they want somebody to be able to do all these things, but then offer them this terrible salary. It's just like, what do you expect?
It was bad. But so don't do that. Practice your poker face. Don't be like me.
I don't have a poker face. I don't know how to play poker, so as you know. But anyway,
I'll teach you. It'll be great.
Face. You can't give away your emotions in chess either. So
What's the same face?
Same face. Mine is just worry all over my face. Like, oh god. Anyway.
So the third one is availability heuristic. So this isn't really commonly known, and there's a lot of overlap with other stuff as well, because it kind of can like hook into anchor bias. It kind of can hook into confirmation bias, right? And it's basically when people judge like the likelihood of an event based on how easily they can recall certain pieces of information.
Yeah.
Right. And normally, whether the likelihood of you being able to recall certain pieces of information normally relies on how memorable it is. And so when people are kind of trying to estimate risks or outcomes, it basically means that they're not being estimated very well. Right, because they're really tied in on memorable pieces of information. And as we all know, based on at this point, we know how everybody interacts with like media, full stop. Human beings are so drawn to entertainment. And so those memorable pieces of information are normally sensationalist, right? Or sensationalized in a way. We're drawn towards sensational pieces of information and they become memorable. That's why slogans work so well in politics, which I hate. And so that's the availability heuristic. And this is also a really tricky one.
I know.
To do.
It just depends on what's most recent and what's in your brain that you're just focused on. And this reflects how we have felt about the Lively Baldoni thing. Because when that came out first, the first part was like, oh my God, I'm so entrenched in this and I believe this side. And then months later, the other thing comes out and you're like, I'm on the other side. So it's like whatever is most recent and most interesting in the news, like switches your views on things.
Well, that's kind of it, because it also ties into recency bias, right? Which is the other one. So recency bias is about basically the most recent piece of information. What all of these are, you think about recency bias, confirmation bias, ice cream, all of these things, they're all of the same, like they're the same. It's all ice cream, different flavors, right? What they're all telling you is that you cannot trust your brain to make decisions based on facts and data. Yeah. So obviously there are tons of different ways as humans that we rely on instinct and all of that, and all of those things are very valid. But when it comes to making data-based decisions, which is really what shows up in the workplace most, then all of these kind of biases and fallacies really come into play, and it just kind of tells you that you cannot really trust yourself. And so I had up here now a great example of the availability heuristic, because I actually couldn't come up with an example in my own company for once. This time, so
in your company that doesn't exist.
Oh no, all the examples are ones that definitely 100% did happen. But then when I was looking it up, I was like, oh, actually, this has happened. So I was like, oh, so a great thing is say you're looking at reviews online, you want to buy a new jumper, and it's got 4.9 out of 5 stars, and you, as I tend to do, I'll look at the reviews, but then I'll also look at the 1-star reviews and then the mid ones, and then kind of take from there. But you could have 100 great reviews and 1 really bad review, and you'll really remember that bad one. It's kind of like in the workplace, if you're getting feedback from people, you could get loads of great feedback, or even just a lot of neutral stuff with people, but that one piece of bad feedback really, really sticks in your head. Yeah. And so we not only are we kind of predisposed to remembering sensationalist pieces of information, we're predisposed to remember negative pieces of information.
It holds more weight than positive stuff.
Yeah. And so this is when you think about customer satisfaction. So this is where I was thinking turn up in the workplace. Customer satisfaction. So you have 100 clients, and one of them just loses their shit over something, and the complaint escalates up, right? So it gets up to your your big boss. What tends to happen almost in every case that I've seen this, by the way, is that now your big boss is like, wow, our customer satisfaction is tanking, and all of our customers are so upset, and they have this one example that they'll churn out at every single meeting for 3 months, and they're like, because this thing happened, we need to really put all of our efforts into solving this is such a huge problem. And it's really hard to say to them, it's like, okay, well, our other 99 customers are very happy with what we're doing. So that one piece that's really sticking in your head, you're not able to appropriately, or at that point, you are not appropriately and accurately estimating the outcome or the risk associated with this one customer's lack of satisfaction. And so the risk there is that you start misappropriating resources because you have determined that this is a much bigger risk to the company than it actually is. And so you'll spend more resources on solving that problem when you didn't actually need to, right? And so, that obviously affects the company in a multitude of ways, as people can guess. So that one can be a really, really tricky one to deal with, especially when people are trying to make really quick decisions on stuff as well, is they're relying on what they remember about a situation that normally tends to be the most sensationalist or the most negative thing. That, or sometimes the best thing, they heard a great story and they're like, oh, but this one, I met this one customer for lunch and they were singing our praise, and it's like, okay, great, but we have a 50% buy-in turnover. Clearly that one customer was not the answer. They might have been satisfied, but we're really having problems here, we need more resources. So it can work like in the reverse as well. It just means that we're kind of more, you see it more happening in the negative side just because we're human beings. It's kind of what we do. But it does happen in the other way as well, where people really hone in on this one piece of like positive information. So that's, so it's really about the most available piece of information you have in your head and how you over kind of focus on that to estimate an outcome or to estimate like a risk, and how then you invariably will get it wrong.
Do you know, I was thinking that this is relevant to as well. So not recently, but in the last couple of months, there's been like a lot of like plane crashes and things like that. And because it's in the media and it's like, you know, it's very prominent in your mind, I saw that, you know, numbers of passengers had gone down or something, or people weren't booking as many flights because that's so prominent, even though it's such a small percentage of flights that would ever happen to. And it would, you know, the chances are it's not going to happen to you, but because it's so recent and so negative, and such a big thing, that it's just going to be in your mind for, I don't know, maybe weeks, months at that, before you decide that, okay, actually it's fine, there hasn't been an accident in a long time, which is probably when there's going to be one. But so that's like in the normal thing outside of work as well. Those type of things can affect people.
So that's a lot of that's availability heuristic. It's also confirmation bias as well.
They all, you know, they all, and
recency bias too. We haven't talked about recency bias yet. Maybe we should have grouped all of them together.
I know, the ones that are similar to each other. It's funny though that our minds haven't caught up with everything else. You know, we have so much data available now to make better decisions, but we're still predisposed to use those skills that we would have used, you know, hundreds of years ago. But you know, we're still using those, even though we have other options to find out more information. But you know, we're just hardwired to automatically use our thoughts and predispositions that we have. So it's so interesting.
I think, you know, like as like our brains are designed to filter information, right? Because we do have so much information coming in. It's literally designed to try and filter and surface the stuff that is most relevant to you and for survival. And in a lot of these things, you know, you think about confirmation recency, it's pattern recognition, right? You think, oh, I've seen this often enough, it must be important, right? That's makes sense, right? If you consider how society works. When it comes to things like, you know, the anchoring bias, a lot of the time it comes into play when you know, you're thinking how a society might gel together, right? And how first impressions of things make the lasting effect. Like, you know, if you touch a fire and it's hot, that's gonna stick in there. You're gonna remember that one, right? And so those things are important in a lot of ways that have helped us survive, and it helps like society kind of thrive. But when it comes to data-driven decisions in a workplace, which is a relatively new thing in human history, then it starts to work against us a little bit. And like with the availability heuristic, like one of the ways again to deal with it is to not rely so much on your own memory, to understand that memory is fallible, and to really just take all of the data that you have and lay it out and look at it, right? Like it's almost the same solution for all of the other ones.
Just realizing you're doing it and then trying to counteract it.
Yeah, exactly. And especially when it comes, like, I mean, you have to look at how important the decision is that you're making, or the prediction is that you're making. If it's a big one, then you got to pull in more people, you know, look at, you know, what they remember, look at recent scenarios, look at case studies and other things, like look at all the data available and then make a decision. Those kind of things are important. If it's a small one and you know, maybe doesn't really matter too much, you know, then
crazy trying to
exactly. You know, like for example, I'm actually trying to think of a good example that's more positive than negative, but actually no, you know, here's a great one. This is availability heuristic. It's also it's mainly availability heuristic, I think. I can't drink shots. Have I ever told you this?
So
this is also anchoring bias, actually.
Why? Because you had a bad experience the first time you did it?
Yes, that's it. I could go into the incredibly funny story that I did, but you know, it was underage drinking and so on. So, but yes, literally terrible experience first time. When I didn't drink because, you know, you're 17, you're not really actually drinking, right? You know, and I had gone to a house party, and I had just gone to a house party the same day I came back. Funny enough, from having flown back from Canada, I was like, yeah, I have an uncle who lives. So anyway, we were on holiday.
So you were jet lagged as well.
I was so jet lagged. went to this house party that, sorry, mom and dad wasn't meant to be there. And
what was it a shot of?
Well, this is the thing. So I turned up late because I had literally come from like the airport. Turned up late. People were like, "Oh, you need to catch up," and they handed me a shot. We were outside. This is relevant for later, and thank God. And I was like, "What's in it?" And they're like, "Oh, just like a bit of everything that we have left over."
Oh no, like a dirty pint.
Yeah. And so this was the first shot I ever had. I want to look cool. So I downed it, and then like 2 seconds later, I just threw up all over the court.
Nailed it.
Just, the coolest I've ever been in my life.
And now you can't drink them ever again.
And I literally can't drink shots. I've tried, and every time it's just, I'm like, oh, no.
Oh, no, just the reflex is just...
Yeah. So, yeah, can't drink shots, won't drink shots. Just done. Just decided the word for me at that point.
It's probably better.
And that's what it is. That's what it is, right?
Yeah, that's true, actually. Well, that worked out well for you.
Yeah. So, like, and the thing is, has that done me any harm? No. In fact, it's probably good. It's probably good. It's probably done me some good over the years, especially in my 20s. And so sometimes, like, it's there for a good reason, right? Mm-hmm. Like, there are reasons why these things exist.
It's like, don't do this again. Your brain's like, that when we did it the last time, it didn't go well for us. So
yeah, no.
I wish I had that perspective for a lot of things. It didn't go well. Maybe don't do it again. Don't say that. Yeah. Oh my God.
Yeah. So, but at work, look at the data, get other people's opinions, look at potentially like long-term perspectives. Like, don't put too much weight on single event stuff, right? There's ways to deal with it. It's trickier. But again, I think, we could probably look at grouping all of these particular ones together, where the solution is just take a breather, look at the data objectively as you can, see if you can get other people's opinions, see if you come to the same conclusion, and then make a decision. Just like take a beat, basically take a beat and really look at the data, and just don't kind of trust that initial reaction.
Very wise words.
Well, sure, tons of people have said it before me.
No, this is the first time this information is being shared publicly. Oh God. Well, okay, we'll do the I think we've got like 12 of them that we identified. So yeah, this will
do we have the full, I don't know if it's a full 12 or if it's 10.
Okay, well, we still got
series,
we'll
have a look.
I won't overwhelm everybody with the different biases and fallacies, but I think they're really interesting. I love knowing how the mind works, especially in the workplace, from being in it for so long and being like, why is that person doing that? Or like, it seems like such a stupid decision. But I mean, I'm sure I do them as well, but I'm not self-aware enough to notice. Just again, being aware, thinking about it, and not trusting your brain 100% straight away, which is...
Knowledge is power. Mm-hmm. In this, sure very is. Specifically in these situations, knowledge is power.
Yeah. So, do you have a red flag of the day you'd like to discuss?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Go ahead.
It's less about it being in a company. That's about, be part of a company, and more about like forming a relationship with a company as a potential client, or you being a client of a company, like working with a company. The red flag there. So we were talking about this a little bit earlier. So I'm sure everybody is very familiar with the absolute mass of like cold emails and calls that you get from people. And honestly, some weeks I'm just like, I just don't respond to any of them, because I'm like, it's too much, right? It's just too much, and it's constant, and it's too much. And we both noticed obviously the uptick since we started putting more stuff out online. We have obviously attracted more, and that's fine.
We look successful. Fine. People want to work for us.
That's great. I mean, and that's great. Like, that's genuinely good. But if somebody approaches me and it is something that looks like it could be for us, right? And so, to be clear, in case anybody doesn't know, we provide kind of like fractional consultant and advisory services, right? We do it for startups and small businesses. Basically, a lot of the stuff we talk about on this, although this is mainly opinion stuff, we've focused more on operations and marketing.
Facts. It's all facts.
Yeah, all facts. And so, if you spend a minute on our website, you will see that it's very clear that that's what we offer. And so it's very clear that we're not like in manufacturing, or we're not in retail, or we're not in software development. Yeah, not yet. ourselves. Like that's not, we might advise maybe some of those companies, but we are not in the business of those things. And so if I get a cold email where someone is like, it's genuinely for me. So some people have, come to us and said, hey, I do kind of web development and whatever. And I say, that sounds really great, but actually Leslie's here and that's what she does. But great, thanks. But, thanks for reaching out, but, unfortunately not for us. Yeah. So it's all very polite. And I just kind of state the situation very clearly because I know what it's like on the other side where you have to have like a reason. And they'll also judge it based on like, is it a no, never, or is it like a maybe in the future, right? And that's important. So I try to give them the information they need for their like, kind of CRMs. And so that happens a lot. People might come and people have come for like business development and they've said, hey, I'll generate leads for you. And I'll be like, that sounds great, but unfortunately, yada, yada, yada. And that's fine. Very nice and polite. And then, so to be clear, I'm not talking about those people. Those people are great. They're just doing their job. They are reaching out with the appropriate research to the right people. If any company is coming to me, pitching me something that is clearly not for me. So someone's coming to me and be like, hey, at Red Insight Group, we noticed this. So here's how we can like help you expand your software development team. And I'm like, that's clearly nothing to do with me. First of all, we don't have one. And second of all, that's not what we do. Those kind of people I've stopped responding to. So in the interest of trying to prioritize my time, I've stopped responding to those people on the assumption that like, if you haven't put in the barest like cursory glance at our website to see if this is actually for me, then I'm not going to give you the same courtesy back. Mm-hmm. And also, it pretty much means that I've kind of red flagged that company.
Yeah.
So that company is now red flagged for me. I probably only remember the name of the company 50% of the time, right? So maybe luckily there's other companies. But like if I come across that company now in the future, I'm less inclined to do business with them because to me that's a red flag for like, bad organization, bad management, poor efficiency within the company, which generally means that I'm not going to get a good deal because if you've got poor efficiency, your prices are inflated, or that the organization is bad such that maybe they're not actually delivering a great product, it's disorganized. And I realize that that's an outsized reaction to what potentially could just be one person not doing a great job, but it's a red flag. And as a red flag, that is something that sticks with me. So if you seek me out to sell me something that's clearly not for me, if you took 2 seconds to look at something, then that company is red flagged for me forevermore.
Well, they represent that company, so technically, it is that company if they're trying to sell something for them. So they shouldn't have somebody. If it is just the person, they should know better than having a person doing that. Reaching out to a cold, like freezing cold lead that has no potential, like ever, pretty much waste of everybody's time, really.
Yeah.
We see it a lot on LinkedIn. Like we've been getting a lot of messages on LinkedIn about all this and that, and they clearly haven't even looked at our profile, or in that case, they didn't clearly see that I was a woman when they offered me services for men. So unless they did.
And honestly, I've had great chats with people where like I'm like, look, I'm not in the business for what you're offering right now, but like let's connect and chat. Like I've done that loads. I've had chats with people that like. We're probably not going to do business with each other in the next few years, but like you're generating those relationships, and from that have come relationships where I'm like, they're now on my list for if I do ever need those services, I know I'm going to go to these people. Works in the reverse as well.
That's why the argument for like the soft kind of sell is good, because you're not pressuring people into something, but you're putting the idea in their mind in a kind of roundabout way that they don't feel like they're being sold to, and that's a longer process. But it pays off, better in the end. Yeah. But people do want to see results straight away, pretty like a lot of the time. So the long game, doesn't always work.
What about your red flag of the week?
Well, red flag of the week for me, one of many. Sometimes when I see marketing campaigns that are trying to capitalize on trends and things like that, that really puts me off, because by the time you're able to get a marketing campaign through approvals, processes, all that type of thing, the trend is pretty much gone. And it's not, again, recency bias or whatever, it's not recent in your mind. So it just comes across as a bit cringe, or like you're trying too hard to like hop on the bandwagon of like a TikTok trend or something like that too. Yeah. And I always, when I see companies saying, oh, we need a TikTok, I'm like, but why? Do you need a TikTok? What are you going to share on that? It requires so much work and like special like people to do that, like specialists in that role. And I see companies like consulting companies with TikToks, and they're like trying to reach a younger audience, but they're not doing it properly. So therefore it's off-putting, and like that's a red flag to me, that they're not appreciating the skill behind it enough to do it properly. And I've seen it in companies I work for too. Like somebody who didn't have any social media experience was in charge of the company TikTok, and it was dreadful. And it was just like, yeah, we're on TikTok. Look at us, we're so cool. And on the other hand, the people they were marketing to, the younger people, would look at that and be like, this is terrible. Like, this is so awkward. Why are you like, why? This is not where I want to see my recruiters being cringed, you know? Like, they're going to go to your website, like meet them where they're at. Like, I know companies can market their products and stuff to people on TikTok if they do it right again. But in terms of like trying to recruit people by putting up cute videos or things like that aren't done well, it really more looks negative than positive on your brand. So that's always a red flag for me if I see a company trying too hard on TikTok, not doing it correctly. And it's just like you're not giving it the credence it deserves. So that's another red flag.
I do think that, like, especially some bigger companies or companies where like the age demographic of a company might skew older, or just less in the media, like less media literate, I guess, or social media literate. I understand what you mean. It can go really wrong because a lot of them, they don't necessarily understand how different the different social medias are, and how differently you have to engage with them if you're going to be kind of like in the zeitgeist. And they don't give enough importance to it either, because I think, I mean, like, we post some kind of funny stuff on TikTok every now and again that we find funny, but like, we don't have any following on there, nor do we really like put much attention into it. But it's also just because like you kind of have to have a casualness approach to it. And also I think a lot of them like that, if they're posting videos and stuff, the approvals process is too long, particularly with TikTok. It's so much work because one, you have to be on there the whole time and constantly like adjusting your algorithm to make sure it's as broad as possible so you can see what's popping up. And then you have to give kind of like almost free reign to those people to just do stuff quickly and get it out there. Otherwise you miss the trends.
Which is risky.
And you not take it too seriously, right? Whereas a lot of people will look at those campaigns and treat it like something they're going to post on Facebook or even Instagram, which is kind of a slower, like a much kind of slower, kind of different curated content. Yeah, I think that you're right. That nuance isn't appreciated a lot, which to me, if it was like a company, to your point, is a red flag. It's indicative of like an internal, like what they're focused on. And if they're trying to be on top of trends and they're failing that miserably, then it's a red flag for there being potentially some outdated management in there, or a company that moves too slow, like it's incapable of making quick decisions on things as well, or taking risks, or like a bunch of other stuff, right?
I know there's so many things that can indicate it.
And it's even, I think it's like, I mean, we could talk about maybe TikTok is a whole other thing, and neither of us are experts on it, but even so, it's like what started coming up in FYP recently was just some funny videos, the same format each time. It was like, making my boss read out my Hinge messages, right? Or Tinder messages.
Jesus.
And they would always like, one person would say this, there'd be two guys in the back, and they kind of have this thing they slap in their hand, which I realized afterwards were hairbrushes, because it turns out they were a hair company. But I had watched 10 videos probably of this, thought it was very funny, started following them, had no idea who they were. And then probably about 10 videos in did I discover that, it's a company and they sell hair stuff. And then when I went to get my hair done last week, my hairstylist was using her stuff. I was like, oh my God, that's those people. And she's like, oh my God, they're great. She was like, tell me about them, because they're out in Niagara. So they were like a local company. And that's it done correctly, because they're not there, kind of shoving like authentically. They're getting into your kind of head.
Messaging.
Exactly. And like, now I know who they are. And now I kept seeing their products everywhere. And now, honestly, if I'm looking for a new hairbrush, I'll probably buy one of theirs. You know what I mean? It's actually, and that's done really well. Like, really well.
It's stealth marketing, where you're integrating yourself into somebody's life without forcing your brand on them or whatever. So you're just there, and then suddenly you start to notice more things. And then again, long game versus short-term strategy. You're not going to see, you didn't go straight away and buy that product, but like a month later you might spend $200 on a hairbrush, and so it all depends on, again, the management and the leadership in there and what they're trying to do, and if they listen to the people who understand the trends and how to get the specific customers on the platforms as well, because that strategy could be different to their one for Instagram or for LinkedIn or anything like that. It's
100% different. Yeah.
It's definitely not the same. You can't kind of do everything, paint them all with one brush. So understanding that is key.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's a really great red flag, because I think to ignore social media in your marketing is to the detriment of a company, obviously loosely depending on their market, but for the startups and small businesses that we work with, right? It could be to detriment. But you have to be able to recognize the differences and be able to manage them effectively. And if you're not, then you're not paying attention. You're not paying attention to your customers.
Wasted resources.
Yeah, and you're not paying attention to your customers, you're already struggling. So
So choose, if you're a small business, choose a couple of platforms or even one that you can do well and build from there. Don't try and do them all at one time. So if it's just Instagram, focus on that, do it really well, and then as you gain customers, you can employ experts in different areas and kind of expand your social media presence to do a bit more.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah. So there were our red flags for the day. Or for the week.
For the week.
Yeah. I'll have to
time now. We've started to do this thing, and then we won't be able to think of any more.
I know,
we're exhausted.
We've exhausted all the red flags ever. So yeah. All right. Well, we'll continue this conversation with the next fallacies and biases next week.
Yeah. We'll either do one with all 4, but that might be too much. We might split it into 2 and 2.
Yeah. We'll see. We'll see how we get.
See how long we take. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.